The wind blew hot and harsh across the dry plains, stirring the earth into dust devils that spun across the barren land, leaving nothing but scorched earth in their wake. The sun was a relentless brand in the sky, burning everything it touched, from the scattered clumps of sagebrush to the abandoned houses and broken fences that dotted the landscape. In the distance, a lone horse kicked up a trail of dust as it trudged toward the small, weary ranch house that had been Sarah's prison for the last 4 years. Sarah Mitchell was a widow, though she didn't carry the word lightly. It hung over her like a heavy, faded banner that no one dared to lift. She had been married to a man who had once been full of promise, but the war had hollowed him out. What came back wasn't the same man who had left. After his death, the town had whispered things about her, about the way she had been left alone to carry the weight of the ranch, and how her heart had been too fragile for the harshness of this place. They said she couldn't bear the pressure, that she wasn't made for this life of dirt and toil. The truth was, the ranch was dying. She was dying. Not physically, but something in her had cracked the day Tom had been buried, and it had never healed. The dreams she'd once had of running the ranch together, of raising children under the same roof, had all turned to dust. She tended to the livestock as best as she could, but each day felt like a struggle to hold on, a struggle against the wind and the weight of her own guilt. Her hands, once soft from years of housework and gentle labor, were rough now, calloused. But even with all that hard work, Sarah never felt like she belonged in this world. The other women in town avoided her, and the men, well, they never saw her as anything but the widow, who had no right to grief. She had become a ghost, walking through the motions of survival with nothing to show for it but a ranch that was falling apart at the seams. This was the world Sarah had built for herself, a quiet, solitary world where the only sounds were the wind and the occasional cry of a coyote in the distance. She had no hope left, no love, just the land, which had begun to take its toll, slowly turning her into one of its own barren souls. But that all changed when he arrived. She first saw him one evening, just as the sun began to sink behind the mountains. She was mending a fence, trying to hold the posts together, before they completely gave way, when she heard the soft clop of hooves on the dirt road. At first she thought it was one of the men from town, coming to check on her. But no, this rider was different. There was something in the way he moved, a quiet confidence in his posture, the long coat that fluttered like a shadow against the golden light. His horse slowed as he approached, its hooves barely making a sound as it stopped a few feet away from Sarah. She didn't look up at first, focused instead on the rope in her hands, tying the last of the posts together. But she could feel his presence. The air seemed to thicken around him, and when she did look up, her eyes met the calm, steady gaze of a man whose face was weathered by time and hardship. He wasn't tall, but he carried himself like a man who had seen too much and learned to keep his secrets close. His clothes were worn, as though he had been on the road for weeks, maybe months. And there was something in the way he stood, rooted to the earth, yet detached from everything around him, that made Sarah feel both uneasy and strangely safe. He spoke, his voice low, with the rough edge of a man who'd lived a hard life. "Looks like you've got your hands full," he said. Sarah didn't answer right away. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tugged at the rope, as if she could focus on that and not the stranger standing in front of her. His presence made her feel exposed in a way she hadn't in years. Finally, she looked up, her eyes narrowing in suspicion. "What do you want?" He didn't flinch at her tone. Instead, he offered a small, almost imperceptible smile, his lips pulling back just enough to show the faintest hint of warmth. "I'm just passing through. Thought I'd offer some help with that fence." Sarah's gaze flickered to the posts, then back to him. There was something about him that made her cautious, but also curious. He was a drifter, she thought. Probably just another broken man looking for work. She had seen enough of them in her time to know the type. "I don't need help," she replied stiffly, turning her back to him and grabbing another rope. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then quietly, almost as if he were talking to himself, he said, "I've seen a lot of men leave ranches like this. You're a stubborn one, aren't you?" She didn't respond. Instead, she picked up the hammer, the sound of the metal ringing out in the empty space. The sun was almost gone now, and the chill of the evening began to creep into the air. The winds had picked up, tugging at the edges of her worn dress, sending the scent of sagebrush and earth swirling around them. For a long while, there was only the sound of their breathing, the steady rhythm of Sarah's work, and the distant cry of a hawk circling in the sky. Then, when she thought he might have left, she felt the ground beneath her shift, and she heard him moving toward the fence. "You've got a good eye for what's broken," he said, kneeling down beside her. "But fixing it, well, that's something else entirely." Sarah didn't look at him. She was used to being alone. But something in his voice, the softness, the understanding, made her hesitate. It made her want to stay silent, to see what he would do next. "I've got nothing to lose," she said finally, her voice quieter than she intended. The words hung between them like an old wound. "But I don't need help. Not from anyone." The cowboy didn't answer right away. He just reached down, his large hand brushing against the wood of the post. His fingers worked with a quiet expertise, steady and deliberate, fixing what she couldn't. In the soft evening light, Sarah watched, her heart hammering in her chest. She couldn't explain why she didn't send him away. Maybe it was his hands. Maybe it was the way he moved. But something in her, something deep and old, shifted, and that was the beginning. The days that followed weren't so much about the work as they were about the silence between them. The cowboy, he hadn't given her a name yet, though she couldn't bring herself to ask, kept coming back day after day. He showed up in the mornings, usually at the break of dawn when the light was soft, and helped her with the ranch. He worked with the steady efficiency of someone who had lived through hard times, his hands never pausing, his gaze always ahead, never lingering on her for too long. At first, Sarah tried to ignore him. She went about her chores with a determined air, keeping to herself, pushing the feelings that he stirred deep inside her to the farthest corners of her heart. It was easier that way, safer. A woman who had been burned once couldn't afford to get too close again. But over time, his presence began to feel less like an intrusion and more like a quiet comfort. It wasn't just the work. It was the way he listened, the way he didn't judge her when she snapped at him or told him to leave. He'd just nod and go about his business, never pushing, never rushing her. There were moments when their hands brushed, their fingers lingering for just a second longer than was necessary, but neither of them spoke of it. It was as if they had both silently agreed to leave things unsaid, for fear that naming it would shatter the fragile thread of connection that was beginning to form between them. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air grew cooler, Sarah was standing by the barn, her eyes on the horizon. She could feel him behind her, his presence a quiet weight in the air. She didn't turn to face him. She didn't need to. She could sense him there, the soft sound of his boots crunching on the dirt, the way the wind tugged at his coat. "Why are you here?" she asked, her voice rough from disuse. He didn't answer right away. He let the question hang between them, the tension thick in the air. Then, after a long pause, he spoke. "Because someone has to help," he said simply. His voice was steady, but there was something in the way he said it, something almost tender, like he had known pain too, and wanted to share it with someone who understood. Someone has to fix things. Sarah's breath hitched, though she tried to hide it. She didn't want to feel anything for this man. She didn't want to feel the way her heart fluttered when he was near, or the way his gaze made her feel like maybe, just maybe, she wasn't invisible, after all. She swallowed the lump in her throat and turned away from him, trying to steady herself. "You don't owe me anything," she said, though the words didn't sound as strong as she hoped. "I didn't ask for your help." He stepped closer, and she could hear the soft rustle of his coat, the sound of his breath in the cool evening air. "I'm not here because you asked," he said quietly. "I'm here because I want to be." Sarah stiffened, the words hitting her like a blow to the chest. He didn't owe her anything, but he had chosen to be here, to stand beside her, even when she had pushed him away. She felt the weight of it, the quiet defiance of it. But there was no anger in his voice, no demand. Just a simple truth, one she wasn't sure how to respond to. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the world around them settling into the soft rhythm of dusk. The crickets had started their song, and the faint sound of the wind in the trees whispered through the air. And yet, the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was something more, an understanding, a shared moment that neither of them could name, but both of them felt. Then, almost as an afterthought, he spoke again. "I can't stay forever," he said, his voice a little more distant now, "but I'll help as long as I can." The words landed on Sarah like a gentle promise. There was no need for elaboration, no more explanations. She didn't need him to stay forever. What mattered was the here and now. And in this moment, the weight of his presence, steady and unyielding, was enough. She finally turned to face him, her gaze softening. Her hands, worn from the work, trembled slightly, but she didn't hide them. She didn't hide anything from him. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper, but it was all she could offer. A simple acknowledgement of what he had given her, the quiet kindness that she hadn't known she needed until he had shown up. For a moment, he looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers, as though he were trying to see something buried deep inside her. Then, without a word, he nodded and walked away, his silhouette merging with the darkness. Sarah stood there for a long while after he left, the silence now wrapped around her like a heavy cloak. She wondered what had brought him to her, what had driven him to this broken ranch on the edge of the world. Was it fate? Or was he just another man who had wandered in search of something to fix, only to leave when the job was done. But then, as the stars began to twinkle in the sky above, something inside her shifted. A quiet, subtle shift, one that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone anymore. Maybe there was something more waiting for her here, in this dry, desolate land. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to hope. The days grew longer as the heat of the summer stretched its arms over the land, blistering and unrelenting. Yet in the midst of the oppressive heat, there was a small, strange act of defiance growing quietly on the ranch. The cowboy, though Sarah still didn't know his name, had stopped bringing tools or talk of repairs. Instead, one morning, he showed up with a small sapling in his hand, cradled gently like a newborn. His face, usually so unreadable, carried an unusual softness that morning, as if he carried something more than a tree. He carried a promise with it, wrapped in dirt and roots. "I thought you might like it," he said, the words simple but heavy with meaning. He placed the sapling gently into Sarah's hands, his fingers brushing hers for a moment longer than necessary. "It'll grow strong here, like the land." Sarah stared at it for a moment, the tiny tree struggling to survive in the harsh conditions of the high desert. A tree in this dry, cracked earth seemed as foolish as a dream buried in the dust. But she could see the care in his eyes, the way he held it, the way he trusted it would thrive, despite everything. "It's too hot for it here," she said softly, turning the small tree over in her hands. "It won't survive." But the cowboy didn't waver. "Maybe it'll need some help. Everything needs a little help sometimes." There was something in his voice, something tender and quiet, that made Sarah pause. She looked up from the tree into his eyes, seeing something there she hadn't before. Something real. Not just a drifter, not just a man passing through. Something that was, for the first time, rooted. Something that could stay. He stayed with her that morning, digging a small hole by the barn, and together they planted the sapling. The work wasn't difficult, but there was a kind of sacredness to it. Each shovel of dirt felt like a prayer, each movement slow, deliberate. It wasn't just the land they were working. It was something between them, something tentative that was taking root in the silence. The cowboy didn't ask for her gratitude, and she didn't offer it. There was no need for words, just the steady rhythm of their hands working together, the ground softening beneath them. As the days stretched on, the sapling began to settle into its new home, its roots burrowing deep into the earth. Sarah, standing back with her hands on her hips, allowed herself a small smile, a soft curve of the lips, barely noticeable. But it was there. The tree was there. And something else was, too. "I won't be here forever," he said, standing up and dusting his hands off. The words were simple, as they always were, but there was something in his tone, almost a question, as though he was waiting for her to tell him to leave. Sarah didn't respond right away. She watched the tree, watched the way the sun fell across the dirt, and thought about what it meant for something to grow in a place where so many things died. "I don't expect you to stay," she said finally, her voice a little quieter than she intended. "But I won't be the one to send you off." His eyes flickered to hers, but he didn't speak. He just nodded slowly, as if the words were enough to satisfy him. And maybe they were. But something else passed between them that day. Something that wasn't said. It was in the way their eyes met and held for a long moment, in the gentle touch of his hand on her shoulder as he walked away, leaving her with the tree, now standing tall and hopeful in the dirt. In the days that followed, Sarah found herself going back to that small tree every morning. She tended to it as best she could, watering it, pulling weeds from around its base. And though the air was still hot, though the wind still blew with all the cruelty of the desert, the tree grew. Slowly, imperceptibly, but it grew, and so did Sarah. She felt it in the small changes in herself, in the way she found herself waking earlier than before, her hands more steady as she worked, in the way she began to notice the smallest details around her, like how the breeze carried the scent of wildflowers in the mornings, or how the evening sky turned a deep, rich purple when the sun set behind the mountains. And most of all, she felt it in the way she looked at the cowboy now. She couldn't explain it, couldn't put it into words, but she could feel it. He had become part of her world, not as a savior, not as a man with some grand solution to her problems, but as a quiet companion, a man who stayed when everything else had left. One evening, when the light had faded and the coolness of dusk began to settle over the ranch, Sarah found herself at the barn, tending to the horses. The cowboy was sitting against the fence, his hat low over his eyes, his legs stretched out in front of him. "You've been helping me a lot," she said, not really knowing what she meant by the words, but needing to say something. The cowboy didn't move. His voice, when it came, was low and steady. "It's nothing. You needed help. I'm just a man passing through. But for now, this is what I do." Sarah's hands stopped moving as she stood there, looking at him. There was something in the way he said those words, in the way he carried himself, like he was carrying a secret, one he didn't want to share, but that she had come to understand, in the quiet spaces between them. "You're not just a man passing through," she said softly, more to herself than to him, but the words felt true. He wasn't. He was part of this world now, as much as she was. Maybe more. He didn't answer, but the silence between them felt comfortable now, no longer awkward. The breeze picked up again, ruffling the edges of Sarah's dress, and she let her eyes drift to the small tree standing a few yards away. "You planted that tree," she said, her voice a little shaky. "You planted it for me." "I planted it for us," he replied, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in a long while. "For the land. For this place," she smiled, the faintest curve of her lips. There was so much more in those words than just the planting of a tree. There was a promise, a quiet bond that was beginning to take root. And then, as the sun sank below the horizon, casting the world in shadows, Sarah realized something that made her heart beat faster. Maybe, just maybe, this wasn't just a desert anymore. This wasn't just a barren place where dreams went to die. This was a place where things could grow, things like trees and love. The summer heat began to soften as the first signs of fall crept over the land. The nights grew colder, and the ranch, once a place of isolation, now felt like a sanctuary. The small tree continued to grow, its roots deepening in the dry, rocky soil. Sarah could see its branches stretch further each day, reaching for the sun in ways she never had. There was something about it, something about that quiet promise, that made her believe that even the hardest places could hold the potential for life. Yet despite the steady presence of the cowboy, despite the soft rhythm of the days, there was still a scar on Sarah's heart. one she couldn't erase. It had been buried for so long, hidden beneath the weight of her grief, but it was there, just beneath the surface. And as much as the cowboy's quiet strength gave her comfort, it also reminded her of what she had lost. One afternoon, when the winds had turned cold and the sky was heavy with the threat of rain, Sarah stood in front of the old, cracked mirror that hung by the door of the cabin. Her fingers brushed over her face, tracing the lines that had deepened over the years. The reflection staring back at her was not the girl who had once dreamed of a life full of promise. This woman, this widow, was someone she hardly recognized. The townsfolk had called her too soft once, too fragile for this life. But the years had changed her. They had hardened her, and in a way, she had let it happen. Her gaze drifted down to the small, tarnished wedding band that still rested on her finger. It had been Tom's ring, the man she had loved, the man who had promised her the world, only to leave her with nothing but an empty bed and an abandoned dream. Sarah ran her thumb over the cool metal, the smooth surface worn from years of use. For a long while, she just stood there, staring at the ring. There was no pain anymore, just a deep, gnawing emptiness. The memories of Tom, of their life together, the laughter, the love, had become as distant as the stars above. She could barely remember the sound of his voice, the warmth of his touch. All that remained was the symbol of a life she would never get back. She could hear the cowboy's footsteps outside the cabin. He had been working on the fence all day, and the sound of his boots crunching in the dirt was familiar now. It felt like a constant, steady presence in her life. A reminder that maybe she didn't have to be alone anymore. But even as his presence became more real, more comforting, Sarah couldn't shake the mark of the past. She couldn't seem to let go of the weight of that ring. Her hand trembled slightly as she reached for it, but before she could pull it off, the door to the cabin creaked open. The cowboy stepped inside, his eyes catching hers in the mirror. "You all right?" His voice was low, the question simple, but it carried something more, something that made Sarah pause. She didn't answer right away. She didn't know what to say. How could she explain the silence in her heart, the way it seemed to grow wider with each passing day? How could she tell him that she was still carrying the weight of a life that had died, even as he stood here breathing new life into her world? I just don't know how to let go," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. "I thought I had, but every time I look at this—" She held up her hand, the wedding band catching the dim light of the cabin. The cowboy didn't speak right away. He just looked at her, his eyes soft, not filled with pity, but something deeper, understanding. "Sometimes letting go isn't about the ring," he said, his voice steady, but his words carrying a weight of their own. "Sometimes it's about what comes after." Sarah turned to face him, the tears threatening to fall, but she blinked them back. She didn't want to cry. Not now, not in front of him. "I don't know if I can," she said, her voice breaking just a little. "I don't know if I can open myself to something new. Not after all that's happened. Not after losing him." The cowboy didn't move. He didn't take a step closer, but his presence seemed to fill the room, filling the space between them with something gentle, something patient. He had no expectations, no demands, just a quiet understanding that Sarah had to find her own way through this, in her own time. He took a breath and then spoke again. You don't have to do it all at once. It's not about forgetting. It's about finding peace. And sometimes peace comes in strange ways. Like a tree in the desert. Sarah looked down at the ring again, her fingers still trembling as she held it. The weight of it felt unbearable now. She didn't want to let go of Tom, but she didn't want to hold on to something that was already gone. With a small hesitant movement, she slipped the ring from her finger, the cold metal clinking softly as it fell into her palm. She stared at it for a long moment, her heart pounding in her chest. Then, with a steady breath, she walked outside, her steps slow but deliberate, and she went to the tree, the one they had planted together, the one that had become a symbol of something new and something growing. She kneeled down beside it, the earth cool beneath her, and with one last quiet glance at the ring, she buried it deep into the soil. The earth swallowed it up, the dirt closing over the metal, and for the first time in years, Sarah felt a sense of release. The past wasn't gone, but it was no longer a weight she had to carry. When she stood up, she felt lighter. The air around her seemed fresher, the sky above her clearer. And when she turned back toward the cabin, she found the cowboy standing just inside the door, his eyes fixed on her. His gaze wasn't questioning, wasn't waiting. It was just there, steady, warm, and patient. "You did it," he said simply, his voice full of quiet pride. "You let go." For the first time, Sarah allowed herself to smile. It wasn't much, but it was something. The smile felt like a crack in the armor she had built around her heart. A crack that was filled with the quiet understanding that maybe she wasn't alone anymore. Maybe she didn't have to carry the past forever. And maybe, just maybe, there was room for something new. The days that followed the burial of the ring were quiet, almost too quiet. Sarah found herself awake at dawn, her hands moving through the familiar motions of the ranch, but something had changed in her. The weight of the past, though not forgotten, no longer held her in its grip. It was as if a small crack had opened in her heart, letting the light in, allowing her to breathe again. And yet, the world around her remained unchanged. The wind still howled through the empty spaces. The land still stretched out in all directions like a barren ocean. The ranch was still falling apart, still in need of repair, and the town, still cold, still distant, kept its back turned to her. But something else had shifted as well. Sarah had begun to notice the small, quiet moments between her and the cowboy. It wasn't just the work anymore. It was the way they moved in sync, the way their hands brushed as they passed tools, the way their eyes met across the barn and lingered for a heartbeat too long. There was something building between them, something that felt like the slow, inevitable growth of the tree they had planted together. But it wasn't just about that tree anymore. It was about both of them. The cowboy hadn't said anything more about staying, and Sarah hadn't asked. She knew he was still a drifter, still a man passing through, but something in the way he looked at her made her wonder if the world had more room for them both, for this quiet, tentative bond that was slowly growing. One afternoon, when the sun had dropped low and the sky was streaked with the first signs of twilight, Sarah was in the barn, brushing down one of the horses. She could hear the cowboy outside, his voice low as he worked, but there was something in his tone that made her pause. It was different. The usual quiet calm was edged with something sharp, something uncertain. Sarah stepped outside, her hand on the barn door, and saw him standing there, his back to her. His shoulders were tense, his fists clenched at his sides. He didn't hear her approach, so she called his name softly, her voice breaking the stillness of the evening. "Riley," she said, the name finally slipping from her lips. He hadn't told her his name for weeks, and though she had suspected it, hearing it now felt like a promise in the air between them. He turned around quickly, his expression shifting to one of surprise, then something more guarded. His eyes flickered to hers, but he didn't speak right away. "You all right?" she asked, walking toward him, her hands still dusty from the horse. He didn't answer for a long moment, his gaze dropping to the ground. When he spoke, his voice was rough, his words slower than usual. "I heard them today. The townsfolk. They were talking." Sarah's heart skipped in her chest. She had avoided the town for weeks, knowing that they had no love for her, no care for anything other than her shame. The whispers, the sideways glances, they had all been there from the start. And now, it seemed, they were turning their eyes toward the cowboy. "What were they saying?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. It was the same as always. The same judgment, the same whispers about her, about him, about the woman who had once been a part of their town and the man who didn't belong. "They don't like that I'm here," Riley said, his voice bitter. "They think I'm just a drifter, a man who doesn't belong anywhere. They're right, in a way. I've never stayed in one place too long. But now," he trailed off, looking toward the horizon, his voice losing its edge. "Now they're starting to talk about you too." Sarah felt her chest tighten. She had known this day would come, but hearing it out loud, the words, the accusations, the expectations, made her feel like a trap was closing around her. "They're saying things about us," he continued, his eyes dark with something unreadable. "About how you're nothing more than a widow, playing at being a rancher. And about me." He paused, his jaw tightening. "They say I'm not the kind of man who should be near a woman like you." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She knew what they thought. She knew how they saw her, as damaged, as undeserving. But to hear it spoken, so plainly, made the words feel like a weight on her chest. "Let them talk," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "They don't know anything about us, about what we've built." Riley turned to her then, his eyes sharp, searching her face. There was a flicker of something in his expression, something softer, something that hadn't been there before. "They don't know us," he repeated, his voice quieter. "But I'm not afraid of their words. I've been running my whole life, but for once, I don't want to run. Not from you." Sarah's heart skipped a beat, and for the first time in months, the air around them felt electric. The space between them, once filled with uncertainty, now seemed to hum with a quiet kind of defiance. She could feel it in her bones, this shift, this change. It wasn't just the tree growing. It was them, too. Riley stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was as if the world had paused around them, the wind dying down, the night holding its breath. Then he reached out, his hand finding hers, the touch both tentative and certain. He squeezed it, his fingers warm and steady. "They don't get to decide who we are," he said softly. "We do." And in that moment, standing there in the fading light, Sarah felt something in her heart crack wide open, It wasn't just about the tree. It was about them. Two broken souls who had come together, not because it was easy, not because it was expected, but because they had chosen each other. Chosen this life. Chosen to fight for something that wasn't about survival, but about living. The cowboy, the drifter, had found something here. And Sarah, the widow, the woman who had been cast aside, had found it too. What if they never stopped talking? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Riley's grip on her hand tightened, his thumb brushing over her skin in a quiet, intimate gesture. Then we'll keep living, he said simply, and we'll make sure they can't ignore us. And in that moment, Sarah knew it didn't matter what the town thought. It didn't matter what anyone else thought. What mattered was the quiet strength between them, the unspoken bond that had begun to grow stronger than any whisper or judgment. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were living. The seasons turned, and with them, the world around Sarah and Riley seemed to shift in ways that were almost imperceptible. The tree they had planted stood tall now, its branches thickening and stretching toward the sky, resilient against the wind, the sun, and the harshness of the land. It had grown as they had, slowly, quietly, but with undeniable strength. In its shade, Sarah and Riley worked side by side, their days intertwined with the rhythms of the ranch, each passing moment pulling them closer. Yet there remained a quiet space between them, a place neither dared to speak of, until that night. It started with the rain, a rare, gentle storm that had rolled in from the mountains, dark clouds swirling above them like an omen. The wind had turned cold, carrying the scent of wet earth and sage, and soon the first drops began to fall, soft at first, then heavier, as if the sky itself had given in to some unspoken desire. Sarah had been in the barn, finishing up the last of her evening chores, when the storm hit in full force. The sound of the rain against the roof was deafening, and for a moment it felt as if the world was dissolving into nothing but water and wind. She had started to move toward the cabin, but then, through the haze of rain and wind, she saw Riley standing by the small tree they had planted. He was there, under the storm, his coat clinging to his shoulders, his face turned toward the sky, as though he was letting the rain wash over him. She hesitated, watching him, feeling the quiet pulse of something deep within her chest. The rain was cold, but it didn't seem to matter to Riley. He stood there, rooted in the storm, his body unmoving, as if he was connected to the land in some primal way. For a long moment, Sarah simply watched him, her heart racing in the quiet of the night. The storm seemed to still around her, the only sound now the pounding of her own pulse. She approached him slowly, her footsteps muffled by the wet ground, and when she was close enough, she reached out, her fingers grazing his arm. "Riley," she called softly, her voice nearly lost in the storm. "You'll catch your death out here. Come inside." He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the dim light, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that made her heart beat harder. It wasn't just the storm. It wasn't just the rain. It was him, standing there, this quiet, broken man, who had come to her ranch, who had stayed when the world had turned its back on them both. For the first time, there was no hesitation between them. No space, no walls, just this moment, this feeling that seemed to hold them together. "I don't want to go inside," he said, his voice low, like the rumble of distant thunder. "Not yet." Sarah's fingers tightened around his arm, pulling him toward her, feeling the warmth of his skin beneath the cold of the rain. She didn't know what had shifted, what had brought them to this moment, but the world outside felt like it had faded away. It was just the two of them, standing in the heart of the storm. "Then stay with me," she said, her voice steady, but filled with something more, something raw, something vulnerable. "Stay with me tonight." Riley's eyes softened, his hand reaching up to brush the rain from her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. She felt the gentleness of his touch, the weight of his presence, and in that instant, she knew she couldn't walk away from him. She couldn't run. Not now. Without another word, Riley pulled her closer, his hands resting on her shoulders, his lips brushing the top of her head. The rain fell harder now, as if the world had surrendered to them, but they were no longer part of it. In that moment, they were their own world, two souls, entwined by love and survival, standing against the storm. The wind howled around them, but Sarah couldn't feel it. All she could feel was the steady warmth of Riley's body against hers, the rhythm of their breaths falling in time. She could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong, and she knew, without a doubt, that this was where she was meant to be. "Don't leave me," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. It was a simple plea, but it was everything. Everything she had wanted, everything she had feared. Riley pulled back, just enough to look at her, his face softening. "I'm not going anywhere, Sarah. Not now. Not ever." His words, simple but filled with quiet devotion, struck her like a thunderclap. And then, as the storm raged around them, Riley leaned in and kissed her. It wasn't hurried, wasn't frantic. It was slow, tender, and full of the kind of quiet passion that had been building between them, one small moment at a time. The kiss deepened, and for a long while neither of them spoke. The world outside continued to unravel, but inside the small bubble they had created, there was only the softness of their skin, the warmth of their bodies pressed together, and the slow, steady rhythm of two hearts, finally in sync. When they finally pulled apart, their breaths mingling in the cool night air, Sarah looked up at him, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. She felt like she had just crossed some unseen threshold, like she had been reborn, and in the same breath, so had he. "We're not just surviving anymore," she said softly, almost as if to herself. "We're living." Riley smiled, his eyes warm, full of quiet satisfaction. He didn't say anything in return, but he didn't need to. His hand found hers again, their fingers interlacing, and together they stood beneath the storm, a bond between them that neither could deny. The rain continued through the night, a gentle rhythm that settled the land in a way nothing else could. By the time the morning light began to filter through the clouds, the earth was softened, the air fresh with the scent of wet soil and sage. Everything felt new, like the storm had washed away the weight of the years, leaving behind something raw and unspoken, a promise unbroken. Sarah stood on the porch of the cabin the next morning, wrapped in an old quilt, watching the last of the mist roll away over the plains. The storm had passed, but something else remained. A quiet certainty had settled in her heart, the kind that comes after a storm, when the air feels clean and the world is wide open again. She could hear Riley inside, his boots scraping against the floorboards as he went about his usual chores. But today, there was a shift in the way he moved. His steps were lighter, as if the storm had not only cleared the sky, but had also swept away the heaviness in his heart. When she turned, he was standing in the doorway, his face framed by the soft morning light. His hair was still damp, his shirt clinging to his broad shoulders. But his eyes were different. There was a new depth to them, a quiet peace she hadn't seen before. He wasn't just a drifter anymore. He was someone who had come to stay. "You're up early," she said, her voice soft but steady, the sound of it familiar, comforting. Riley stepped outside, his boots silent on the wooden steps, and he stood beside her, both of them looking out at the landscape, now washed clean by the storm. "I had to see the land after the rain," he said, his voice low. "Had to see it while it was still new." For a moment there was nothing but the sound of the wind, the faint rustling of the trees in the distance, and the soft drip of water from the roof. The earth felt full, heavy with life, the kind of life that only comes after a storm, when the land is ready to accept what it's been given. "I've been thinking," Sarah said, her hands still wrapped tightly in the quilt. But her gaze turned toward him, her heart beating just a little faster. "About that tree we planted." Riley glanced at her, his eyes softening. "What about it?" "I think it's growing," she said, her voice full of quiet wonder. "Not just the tree. Us. I think we're growing." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a step closer to her, his presence steady and unyielding. And for a moment, they just stood there, the world stretching out around them like an endless horizon. "You've always been growing," he said, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear him. "You just didn't know it." She looked up at him, her heart swelling with something she couldn't name, something too big and too simple all at once. There was something in his words, something in the way he looked at her, that made her feel seen for the first time in years, not just as a widow or a woman with a broken past, but as Sarah, the woman who had survived, the woman who had chosen to live. And that choice, more than anything, was what had brought them here, to this place, to this moment, to the quiet, unspoken truth that they had built something together, slowly, quietly, but with more care than either of them had expected. "I think you're right," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think we've both been growing." He didn't smile, but there was something in his eyes that made her feel like she didn't need to say anything more. They didn't need to explain it. They didn't need to say the words that hung between them. It was enough to know that they had both found something in each other, something that had been missing, but now felt like it was whole. Riley reached out, his hand finding hers, and he squeezed it gently, as though this small act of tenderness was the only promise either of them needed. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, the words soft but firm. "Not this time." Sarah's heart fluttered, and she turned her face toward him, her breath catching in her throat. For the first time, the weight of her past, the pain, the loneliness, the grief, didn't seem so heavy. In that moment, standing in the quiet, empty space of the ranch, it felt like the land itself had opened up to them, like everything that had been broken had been made whole again. And then, as if the world had whispered it to her, Sarah realized something. She had spent so many years looking for a way out of the darkness. But now, standing here, with Riley's hand in hers, and the land stretching wide before them, she realized that maybe the way out was simply to walk forward together, There was no grand gesture, no loud proclamation, just the quiet understanding that they had found something real, something worth fighting for. And as the day began to stretch before them, full of possibilities, Sarah knew that this was what they had been waiting for all along. They were no longer just two people, alone in a world that had forgotten them. They were a team. They were partners. And together, they would build a future from the soil beneath their feet and the love that had slowly, quietly taken root between them. The tree that had started as a fragile thing had become something sturdy and strong, and so had they. In the months that followed, the ranch began to thrive. The land, once barren and unforgiving, seemed to open itself to Sarah and Riley, accepting the care they gave it. The trees they planted grew, their branches reaching higher each day, as if they, too, had found a home in the world. The townsfolk, those who had once whispered behind their backs, started to notice the change. It wasn't loud, wasn't dramatic, but there was something in the way the land seemed to bloom, the way the two of them worked together. It wasn't just the ranch that was changing, it was them. And slowly, the whispers turned to something else. Not kindness, not acceptance, but something else, respect. A quiet, reluctant acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the land had a place for people like Sarah and Riley. And one day, when Sarah walked into town for supplies, a child she had never met ran up to her, tugging at her skirt with wide eyes. Are you the mother of that tree?" the child asked, pointing toward the sapling that had grown into a small, sturdy tree outside the barn. Sarah stopped for a moment, looking down at the child, her heart skipping in her chest. And for the first time in years, she smiled, truly smiled, without the weight of her past bearing down on her. "Yes," she said softly, her voice full of a quiet, hard-won pride. "Yes, I am." The child smiled back and ran off, and Sarah stood there for a long moment, watching the horizon. The wind blew, the trees swayed, and for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she needed to be. And as the sun dipped low, casting the land in a golden glow, she knew, without a doubt, that love wasn't just about finding someone to survive with. It was about finding someone who would help you grow. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe for more videos.